And Wayne, I'm going to start with you. What do you think of when you hear about Ted Turner?
I think about, well, obviously TBS, but I mean, I feel like what you may be hinting at is yes, the Billionaire Ted skits, which I mean, as from more of a WWE sort of like upbringing, I I do feel like that might have been maybe his most prominent sort of like on-screen attachment, you could say, because he was never really a prominent on-screen figure at all in WCW.
I think he's a really interesting figure that in all of the remembrances today, I think you either view Ted Turner in like two ways. Number one is that you grew up within wrestling where he was considered like the person behind WTBS and by extension from Georgia Championship Wrestling to World Championship Wrestling. If you did not follow wrestling and like all of these tributes and obits, wrestling is like not even a mention. It struck me significantly in 2024. They did a 6-part series on him on HBO Max. Wrestling was confined to, I would say, 30 seconds of B-roll maybe in those six episodes. And I think this is like the contrast you see. I am sure that there is a world where today and all the remembrances Ted Turner is being given and being credited for being this visionary behind 24-hour cable news and all of these initiatives, that I am sure there is a Vince McMahon that in some ways Ted Turner was everything that Vince McMahon wanted to be. And Ted Turner, I think it was a distorted view that Ted Turner wanted to be Vince McMahon in wrestling, and it was anything but. I don't think this is a guy that was spending maybe an hour of his year thinking about professional wrestling. Like it was programming that he was certainly saw a huge benefit to, was very loyal to keeping pro wrestling as one of the building blocks on his network. But I don't think this was a guy that was thinking about pro wrestling beyond just a very base level year in, year out. He had way bigger initiatives that he was thinking about. And it's like when you read some of these, it's like pro wrestling is just it's barely even mentioned. It's really remarkable when you see that contrast.
Oh, his accomplishments, I would say, greatly overshadow what really ultimately is a bit of a niche sort of like interest of his in professional wrestling. We're talking the Atlanta Braves. We're talking about CNN. We're talking about like major sort of broadcasting and entertainment things. That, I mean, clearly, like he had enough of a passion in pro wrestling to want to invest in it and to want to showcase it on his channel. But it seemed more of maybe a hobby than something that he was, completely reliant upon, like a Vince McMahon would be.
Like he was a brilliant programmer. Like he understood like a lot of stuff that was like some people don't even know like the origin of like why all of his programming started at 5 past the hour. Like it was simply for you're going down the guide, and this would like you'd have to like it would catch your eye because it was not just in some like straight column with all the other programming at 6 o'clock. And he just thought of like little gimmicks like that. And he definitely had his failures. This was not someone who just had the Midas touch with everything. It was sort of this, he would go into so much debt to finance a lot of these purchases of his. And then things would just come up on his side. Like he would always be able to rebound, but he took many significant risks throughout his career. He had a very difficult upbringing. His father killed himself when Ted was in his early 20s, and that was a very, very traumatic event for Ted. They had a very complex relationship. In one of his books, he saved this letter his father wrote to him when he was in school because he was doing, I can't remember what the program was that he was involved in, something like on the art side. And his father just like excoriates him about like just being this failure. And it's like this just harsh letter to his son. But it was his father's respect that he was always after, and then killed himself. And his younger sister also passed away when she was 17. So this is a guy that had probably a lot of, traumatic experiences at a relatively young, impressionable age that he dealt with. It's not until the mid 80s that he's essentially diagnosed as being bipolar. He's prescribed lithium, and that becomes something that gets known in his public profile. But he bought his first television station in the early in sometime around the 60s, and then it was procuring different radio stations. The first station he buys, it's 1970, and it's WJRJ, which he renames into WTCG, which would eventually become WTBS. And he is able to eventually turn a profit, but then buys the Braves. He then buys the Atlanta Hawks. And then one of the biggest changes to television technology comes with getting his programming onto satellite distribution, which he does at the end of 1976. And this is where they are able to beam their programming across the country. And part of that is Georgia Championship Wrestling as well, which now suddenly we are seeing territorial wrestling that is going to be accessed across the country. And wrestling was something that he, from the earliest stages, he actually struck a deal with Vince McMahon Sr. to air some of their matches out of Philadelphia. That was some of his earliest wrestling. But of course, Georgia was famous for, its link to Ted Turner. There's the big war of 1972 when Ray Gunkel passes away, and you have these two warring promotions, one with the NWA side and one with Ray Gunkel's widow, Ann, and they both get time slots on WTCG, and that's how you get that 2-hour time slot on Saturdays that would last until the year 2000. And you can just go through so much of wrestling history that like Georgia Championship Wrestling became the television to get on because of the penetration and distribution that they had behind it. And Turner was somebody that he would pop up at the studios. Like he took an interest in professional wrestling as well. Like he did seem to be a fan of it. It was not just this blanket programming that he was putting on. Like he did seem to have some level of affinity for it. But from again, it's a very small part of his empire that he continues to grow. There's the launch of CNN in 1980, which people thought was insane, that people would tune in for news 24 hours a day. And, it eventually becomes like the cable network, especially after the Gulf War in 1991, where, that is the turning point for CNN and the demand that viewers had for information. And when there were these catastrophic events, CNN being the go-to, that they knew that there would be coverage there. And it's part of the appeal of CNN even to this day, where it's embedded in people. Like when there is some national tragedy and you want information instantly, if you're turning the television on, it's like CNN sort of made its reputation based off that accessibility to whatever was happening and not having to wait till the evening news or when the news is going to be airing later that night. He buys WCW in 1988, what would become WCW, buys Jim Crockett Promotions. And this is after the experiment working with Vince McMahon in 1984, where he got the TBS slots. And then, yes, with Jim Crockett Promotions out of business, that's when Turner takes over. There's, of course, the advent of Monday Nitro in 1995, which basically changed the wrestling landscape at a time when wrestling was not doing tremendously well in the United States. And it was that choice that made a huge difference for that set the stage for the Monday Night War and where wrestling would have gone without this rival. And that became that was the feud in wrestling. It was less so the programming that either side was presenting, but this real life rivalry that was existing, that was created. And like people talk about today, like the negative side of tribalism, there was a great benefit to this tribalism in the mid-90s because of this war between these two companies and how Vince McMahon really positioned. It was never Eric Bischoff presented as the opposition. It was Ted Turner, like the evil billionaire that was trying to put us out of business and making Ted Turner like the focus of it, when like I don't think Ted Turner was losing too much sleep about Vince McMahon day to day, but you could like if you go back and we always talk about this Sting Triple H match from WrestleMania in Santa Clara, the commentary on that. Like, here is an aspect of Vince McMahon that was just obsessed with this individual and beating this man. Like, that was part of the big speech the night he in 2001 on the final Nitro is, challenging Ted Turner to come down to the ring at WrestleMania to sign the contract. I think Vince McMahon took it as like this big achievement that he beat Ted Turner in professional wrestling and made him the focus of his entire business for those number of years. And just to kind of wrap, I mean, it's a very, very complex story that you can go into with Ted Turner. But of course, the AOL Time Warner merger, like first of all, you have the merger with Turner Broadcasting System with Time Warner in 96. And that's where he becomes like number 2 under this executive Jerry Levine. And then AOL buys out Time Warner in 2001. And that further puts Turner basically out of power. He still retains like a seat on the board. He's still got stock. But that is like one of the biggest disastrous mergers in history, the AOL Time Warner deal, where Ted Turner's net worth goes from 10 billion to 2 billion. Could you imagine being down to 2 billion? It would be rough.
Yeah. What would you do?
You gotta cut back at this point. So, and then he eventually like resigns from the company, sells off all his stock. And it was about 8 years ago, he disclosed that he had Lewy body dementia, which is pretty much like a brain disease. And he had a very, private profile all this time. When that series I mentioned came out in 2024, like he had family that sat down, but the fact he was not even capable of doing an interview, I think that spoke volumes about his ongoing health. And reportedly, he had gone into hospice just recently and then passed away on Wednesday morning as well. I mean, he deserves a lot of praise and credit. This guy was also not a saint either. Like there were a lot of things about him from, the womanizing and such, which, I mean, but, here it was, he in college, there was a story about how he would sing Nazi songs outside of a Jewish fraternity house. He put up KKK signs on the dormitory of black students as well. This is a guy that was, said a lot of stuff that would not fly today, but he sort of had this charisma about him, not unlike Donald Trump, that he could say a lot of stuff that people just kind of took as, well, that's Ted Turner. So, there's that side to him. He's also someone who donated $1 billion to the United Nations. He was an extremely big advocate for environmentalism. He launched Captain Planet, which, as I think about it, my first exposure to anything Ted Turner related was probably Captain Planet when I was a little kid.
Probably mine too.
Yeah. Like before WCW, I would have seen Captain Planet. So there's so much you can talk about with Ted Turner. When I saw this news this morning, it was one of those, oh, geez, that's a real big one. And then in starting to do research, found this article I wrote about him a year ago. And I was like, oh, my God. And not to pat myself on the back, it's a pretty good story, if I do say so myself. So it is up on the website. And this was right after that Call Me Ted series came out. So it's pretty much like the life of Ted Turner that we have republished on the front page and also put the audio version up for everybody on the free tier of the cafe if you want to hear more about this. But quite the photo here. The only photo I'm aware of that features Ted Turner and Brian Knobbs together.
That we know of, at least.
Tonight, we'll talk about it later. Of course, he was honored significantly on AEW programming. Do you think they will cover his passing on SmackDown this week?
I could see it mentioned.
I think it should definitely be mentioned. I think if there was no mention, do you think that would get criticism?
Maybe, perhaps, yeah. It's hard for me to say about these things. I don't exactly know under this current regime what they might recognize, what they might not recognize. But this is, the passing of maybe somebody who is more of a broadcasting legend rather than somebody who is, I would say, maybe, tied to any sort of competition currently, as far as like the broadcast networks go. So I would think yes. I mean, WCW history is their own history at this point. So I feel like it's worth certainly a mention.
I would be very surprised if he doesn't get a mention on Friday. Now, if this was still the Vince McMahon WWE, I still feel it would be. I think it would like even maybe be even more criticized if Vince McMahon, like at the end of this whole thing, still doesn't acknowledge like. Vince McMahon said some horrible things about Ted Turner. I mean, it was very nasty involving the whole thing. But I would be very surprised if they don't bring it up in some kind of mention on Friday. But we will see. If the Post Wrestling Cafe were to undergo a drug test in the month of May, we would be testing positive because we are overloaded with content. We are going to be reviewing Hulk Hogan, Real American, all 4 episodes this month. Plus, we will go inside the Manosphere with a review of the latest Louis Theroux documentary. We will also have coverage of the Ronda Rousey-Gina Carano fight, also taking place on Netflix. Rewind Away tackles WCW Super Brawl 2, and we cover NXT TakeOver Brooklyn from 2015. All that, plus all of the XL editions on a weekly basis, Collision Course, Daredevil Born Again, and so much more. It can all be yours at postwrestlingcafe.com. $8 gets you in the door.